The European Union, probably for the first time since the annexation of Crimea, has decided to really strike at the Russian economy. Not to play games, but for the first time to tell Putin it's time to stop the war.
Hello, welcome back to Joe Blocks. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's happening in the Russian economy, and specifically about the serious tightening of sanctions against Russia.
What are these sanctions, and why, from the European Union's point of view, should they seriously concern the Kremlin?
Now, if you follow the channel, you know that this is actually the second part of this video. In the first part, I talked about energy sanctions, about what's happening with liquefied natural gas and oil, because the European Union is now tightening these sanctions. And in particular, it focuses on China and India as buyers of this oil, and this follows Donald Trump's recommendation. He recently imposed tariffs on India, requiring it to pay for imports into the United States, its biggest export market. He urged the European Union and other G7 members to do the same. And we see that this is happening now,
Trump, as you know, imposed sanctions on India but hasn't touched China yet. The Europeans were told, prove that you really want the war to end.
Financial and technical sanctions. So let's listen to Ursula von der Leyen, who is the leader of the European Union, about what is happening regarding financial sanctions.
We are targeting the financial loopholes that Russia uses to circumvent sanctions. We are introducing a ban on transactions for additional banks in Russia and banks in third countries. We are strengthening the fight against sanctions evasion. As evasion tactics become more sophisticated, our sanctions will adapt to stay ahead.
So I'll just stop her here. She says they're going to add more Russian banks.
This is Ursula trying to whitewash herself a bit. I would say like what we did didn't stop Russia, but it means it hurts Russia, it hinders them. So we weren't just pretending, as Trump says, but actually trying. Well, maybe we didn't try as hard as we should have. All right. How are the new sanctions different from what has supposedly been stopping Russia for the past 10 years? Didn't stop it. So what pushed Europe?
And to ban transactions in
Cryptocurrencies. The European Union is now tightening sanctions to include cryptocurrency. And if you follow the channel, you know that since the beginning of the war, Russia has actually been using cryptocurrency payments as a way to continue making and receiving payments. So if we look at this chart, it's actually hard to get any official data. Obviously, Russia doesn't publish details about what it's doing on the crypto markets, and neither do the crypto markets themselves. Even though there are public records, no one actually publishes anything to say, here's how much Russia is using. These are the latest estimates of how much Russia has used the crypto market since 2021. So, in the year before the war started, it was estimated that there were about $20 billion in transactions in Ukraine.
I recently posted a video about the same thing. Incursions into NATO airspace don't mean, well, let's say preparation for an attack on NATO. Most likely they played a role for Russia's domestic politics, for internal consumption, that's what they're saying, and not on the front lines of the fight. The situation for Russia only got worse because of these incidents, because of these tensions. They did it for some reason, but they weren't testing how to attack NATO. Here's another example of how these incidents happen. They basically got a completely negative response from the European Union for Russia. Details, please.
3 times in 2022, up to 60 billion. So it was a spike as a result of the sanctions. That's why many companies and government agencies started using cryptocurrency, receiving payments for cross-border transactions. In 2023, it was estimated that this increased to $100 billion. So it was becoming more common for many Russian organizations.
It has taken since 2014, which is already 11 years, plus the pressure from Trump. Naturally, they suddenly realized that Russia is waging war and destroying Ukraine with money the European Union pays Russia for gas and oil.
In 2024, it is estimated that this will increase to 140 billion, and in 2025, it is estimated that this figure will rise to 180 billion. And now, many different new methods are emerging that Russia can use. That's why it uses various stablecoins. If you're new to cryptocurrency, stablecoins are pegged to other currencies, mainly the United States dollar. You have a one-to-one peg, so basically they're not prone to the sharp fluctuations in value like other cryptocurrencies. It's essentially a way of receiving payments that's tied to what happens with the United States dollar. So you're not looking to speculate on these markets, you just want to make transactions. That's what Russia is doing. Now, the European Union has announced that it will focus on these crypto markets and try to prevent Russia from receiving and making payments through crypto markets.
We are listing foreign banks connected to Russian alternative payment systems and restricting transactions with organizations in special economic zones.
That is, they built and converted their power plants to gas from coal from anything, knowing that the only supplier of cheap gas is Russia. Interesting, isn't it? Interesting, yes. The European Union is increasing its dependence on Russia while at the same time imposing sanctions and pretending to help Ukraine. Against this backdrop, Boris Johnson's visit to Kyiv came with a demand to the European Union and Biden not to stop the war under any circumstances and not to sign a peace treaty with Russia. This was in 2022, about a month or so after the attack. All of this looks like some kind of through the looking glass. Don't stop the war, please. We'll help you keep fighting. And at the same time, you're converting more and more power plants to Russian gas. Just so you understand, before Crimea, Europe paid $380 per 1,000 cubic meters of gas. In 2022, after the invasion of Ukraine, prices immediately soared to $850 per 1,000 cubic meters. Europe kept paying, of course. That's what they paid. So, the prices for something more than doubled. Well, Russia needed money for the war, for weapons, for soldiers, for this and that, for guns, for tanks. And the further it went, the more Europe paid for gas, while at the same time, all this time, it was switching its power plants from other sources to gas. So, accordingly, with this money, they were supplying Russia with the finances to kill millions, I would say, of Ukrainians. During the August crisis, Europe started to pay. They were ready to pay $2,500 for 1,000 cubic meters of gas, which is 8 times more than in 2014 before Crimea. And only after the entry of liquefied American gas into the market. And the replacement of Russian supplies. Well, partially with alternatives. The price dropped to $500 and $600 per 1,000, which is higher than before. Crimea, of course, but still not $800 or $2,500. Before the events in Crimea, Russia was getting about $180 billion a year from Europe for its energy resources. In 2022, as a result of the first sanctions, Russia's income dropped terribly, down to $160 billion a year. Not a very big difference, right? But now, in 2025, it looks like Russia will earn only $15 billion in Europe. If Europe had struck immediately, then Russia would have deflated. But gradual reductions in purchases led to Russia finding an alternative to Europe, India, which refines the oil and sells it to the same Europe. So the logic of this whole story is as follows. Europeans don't buy oil directly from Russians, but instead buy refined Russian oil processed by Indians. But let's see what else the European Union has come up with. So first, the European Union buys products made from Russian oil from India for $20 billion a year. Most of that money goes to Russia, even though the clever Europeans aren't buying directly from Russia. But now all the Europeans. It seems like these No-19 sanctions are supposed to stop everyone from buying any Russian oil products and so on. and to find alternative suppliers.
But over the past 4 years, we've seen significant growth, and this year it's expected that these payments could reach $250 billion. Therefore, this system will be targeted by the European Union. Until now, Russia has been able to use this system without any problems.
Let me explain. Russia uses shadow tankers that supposedly have no connection to Russia. And now more than 550 of these tankers have been banned. That is, there was a ban on 300 before, and now, well, these ones too. And what is a ban? A ban means passing through European maritime spaces, the ability to stop them there, investigate, question, find out if they have insurance, what kind of insurance they have, and so on. So, well, a serious slowdown, let's say, so to speak, in the transportation of Russian oil to India. I don't know about the products, so to speak, after Indian processing, but at least it will be more difficult to transport to India and China. There might be something interesting here. Trump said to the European Union, "I'll strike China only if you strike first." I don't believe your word that you'll supposedly follow through. First, you do it, and then we'll follow.
Russia. No decision has been made to transfer ownership from Russia to another country. In fact, that's probably unlikely. So we hear that the European Union is going to issue a bond for Ukraine called a reparations bond, and this money will be given to Ukraine. And Ukraine will only have to pay it back after Russia provides the money to cover all the reconstruction work after the war. We have a circular situation. The frozen Russian assets still belong to Russia, but Russia can't access them. This capital will then be transferred to Ukraine by all the countries that are holding it. Ukraine will be able to use this money for defense in the war or for rebuilding its territory, but it's more likely that it will be used to buy more weapons for defense. If the war ends, Russia must legally pay all reparations.
This is nearly a declaration of war, not just against India, but also China. If they really go through with it and not just talk about it, and the United States joins in, then the camp of suppliers, India, China, Russia, will clash head-on with the camp of consumers. But we still have someone to buy from even without them. It might be a bit more expensive, a bit different. We have someone to buy from, but they have no one to sell to. And that's when the proverb about that little mutt or mongrel barking at the elephant will come true. But I wouldn't rely on Europe. Well, not 100%, yeah. They could sell out for
a penny. And if there's no peace agreement and Russia doesn't pay reparations, then basically Russian assets will remain frozen. The loan will remain with Ukraine, and Ukraine will spend this money, and Russia will never get its money back until the war is over and reparations are paid. This way, the European Union has found a way to give more money to Ukraine, justifying it by holding on to Russian assets.
We are adding new direct export restrictions. That is,
for the first time, Ukraine has a chance not only to keep what it has held, but also to have more leverage in negotiations than Russia. Oil, gas, tankers, and finances.
Russia's access to finances and revenues is constantly shrinking, and Russia's overheated war economy is approaching its limit. And what's even more interesting is that when talking directly with partners who communicate with Russians, they say that one of the first requests from the Russians is to lift the sanctions. So we know that our sanctions are effective. They are an effective tool of economic pressure.
Now, if you follow the channel, none of this will come as a big surprise to you. Interest rates are extremely high at 17%, among the G20's highest, and inflation is out of control. But I think what was interesting is that Russian companies are begging the West to lift sanctions because they're losing money. And we have a situation where the war economy is coming to an end. Russia can't keep paying all the companies to support Russia to support the war in Ukraine. And as we've already said, the payments also contribute to wage growth, which helps increase inflation. But unfortunately, from Russia's point of view, the new sanctions proposed by the European Union will really hurt their revenues. And one of the reasons why the European Union is now tightening sanctions is that Russia has started violating the borders of other NATO countries.
This is also a major setback for the underground hydrocarbon trade. Cryptocurrency was a way to do business under the table.
Russia has shown complete disregard for diplomacy and international law. It launched some of the largest drone and missile attacks against Ukraine since the start of the war, striking government buildings and residential homes. By hitting our European Union office in Kyiv, the representation of our union, the threats to our union are also increasing. Over the past 2 weeks, Russian Shahed drones have violated the airspace of our union in both Poland and Romania. This is not the action of someone who wants peace. Again and again, President Putin escalates the situation, and in response, Europe increases the pressure. That is why today I am presenting the 19th package of sanctions.
Now, one of the first statements by Ursula von der Leyen in the 19th package of sanctions was that the European Union will now stop purchasing all liquefied natural gas.
Russia's war economy is supported by revenues from fossil fuels. We want to reduce these revenues, so we are banning the import of Russian liquefied natural gas to European markets. It's time to turn off the tap. We are ready for this. We have saved energy, we have diversified supplies, we have invested in low-carbon energy sources like never before. To be continued.
Now, you may be surprised to hear that the European Union actually hasn't banned the import of liquefied natural gas from Russia until now. But the reason they haven't done this is because many European countries depend on gas. They built power plants that were supplied with gas delivered by Russia through pipelines over the past 50 years. Unfortunately, these pipelines are now shut off.
And small banks in China and India were the loopholes through which Russia circumvented financial sanctions, and shadow tankers helped it bypass the sanctions physically.
So I've illustrated several different levels here. At the top, we have market prices. That's the bright green section. Then we have the dark green section, which shows what would happen if all the price caps were fully enforced. So this is basically the situation we faced. Then I set a price cap at $50, then at $45, and at $30. And you can see that there's a significant reduction in the revenues that Russia receives when you introduce all these different levels. So if this cap had historically been set at $47, Russia would have already been cut off from a huge amount of revenue. But in the future, this is now the new price level, and it will harm the Russian economy because it will receive less revenue. And also, as we heard, a lot more vessels have been added to the sanctions list, another 118 ships. Now we have more than 550 ships that essentially no country imposing sanctions against Russia will be able to use.
Major energy trading companies Rosneft and Gazpromneft will now be under a complete ban on transactions, and other companies will also face asset freezes.
So we see that all Russian oil companies have come under sanctions, which means that anyone who interacts with them now risks facing secondary sanctions. You can't do business with these sanctioned organizations, which means that India and China now risk facing secondary sanctions.
Now we are targeting those who fuel Russia's war by buying oil, violating sanctions. We are targeting oil refineries, oil traders, and petrochemical companies in third countries, including China.
So I think this is probably the biggest issue in the new sanctions. The European Union is now targeting all oil refineries that deal with Russia, including refineries in China. And this has obviously been a major loophole since the sanctions were introduced. Because when India and China bought a lot of crude oil and avoided the consequences, they could process this Russian crude oil at their own refineries, turn it into products like oil, gasoline, and diesel fuel, and then sell these products to the West. Because technically they were buying Indian and Chinese oil, even though in reality this oil was coming from Russia. What the European Union did is what Donald Trump asked to say to China. If you are caught buying Russian oil and refining it at your refineries, then we will impose sanctions against you.
Let's figure it out. The interest on $300 billion of Russian money that is held in European banks will be transferred to Ukraine. Next, when will Ukraine defeat Russia? They don't even say the word. When Ukraine defeats Russia, and Russia will be so defeated that it will even pay reparations to Ukraine and pay them in full for the deaths, destruction, businesses, and everything else. That's trillions of dollars, I believe. After that, the $300 billion lying in Europe will be given to Russia. And after that, Ukraine gives all the money that Europe lent them back to the Europeans. So what probability would you give for this scenario to happen? Well, out of 100, I would give it 0.1%. Honestly, I would give it 0. But I believe in Providence because of the fairy who gives children money in exchange for their lost teeth. And I believe in Santa Claus for one very simple reason. I've played him myself many times. So, what was invented in Europe? We will give a lot more money to Ukraine, and we'll tell our citizens that it's Russian money. We'll forget to mention that it's actually our money. That's it. Well, and of course, we'll get a response from Zelensky. That's what you call a sure thing.
As soon as the European Union and the G7 introduced these measures. So what's the result and conclusion for today? Well, I wanted to publish this video because I believe that this latest round of sanctions announced by the European Union may be the most devastating for Russia out of all the previous 18 rounds we've seen. Because as we heard in today's video, first of all, the European Union is going to stop purchasing liquefied natural gas. In my opinion, it's lacking. I expected an announcement.
I understand. European leaders have found a replacement for Russian supplies. From the interest on the Russian money, $300 billion sitting in European banks, they're accumulating about $6 to $7 billion. That's more than enough to pay kickbacks to all the leaders of the main European countries. A solution has been found. Russia is no longer needed. It can finally be thrown onto the rusty nail. Of course, much of what Russia needs, they will get from China by using their oil. But the suppliers, as I already said, the idea of China-Russia, they are suppliers. They don't have powerful consumer markets, meaning their population's purchasing power is not very high or even very low. And this is the main limitation of supplies so that competitors could replace them in our markets. And most importantly, as I understand it, in these 19 packages of European Union sanctions, this is the main idea.
A 50% tariff on Indian imports to the United States because India continues to buy Russian oil. So this could possibly be the turning point that everyone has been waiting for in terms of stopping these purchases from China and India. China and India haven't responded yet. It'll be interesting to hear their reactions. But realistically, if you look at the economics of the situation, it would be madness to risk all your exports to the United States and Europe just to keep buying Russian oil. Because Russian oil is cheaper than the general oil prices, but not much cheaper. It won't change the economy of either of these two countries. But losing all their exports to the world's largest economies, the European Union as a whole and the United States would absolutely destroy both of their economies. That's why I think these new sanctions could be the turning point we've been waiting for. In terms of Russia having to make a decision, if it loses all this income as a result of these new sanctions, it simply won't be able to survive. It's impossible. Now, what's interesting is that the European Union has announced several other sanctions, which I think are also very important.
Of course, I don't know if Russia, India, and China are ready for such scenarios. Maybe they are. Maybe they have some trump cards that we don't know about or that I don't know about. Anything is possible. But what is clear is that the leaders of the Western world have followed in the footsteps of Donald Trump or have followed him, putting him on their banners. I don't know, say it however you want. Europe has finally started doing something it should have done a year, 2, maybe even 3 years ago. But it has started, and thank God. And Trump, well, let's say, will follow suit. At least I want to say that Ukraine has seen the light at the end of the tunnel, ladies and gentlemen. Ukraine has seen the light at the end of the tunnel. But I wouldn't put all my hopes on the Europeans just yet. Although, as Trump said, you go first and we'll follow, because otherwise they wouldn't have done anything. That's all. Goodbye.